What are we going to talk about today, guys? Well, we're going to talk about blade geometry and why some knives cut better than others. Super Steel Steve actually did a really good video about this when he was talking about the knives that he's making, his kitchen knives. So we're going to talk about blade geometry, edge geometry, and how they affect cutting and what's best, because there really isn't a solid answer for that, because you may want one for one purpose and one for another. So without any further ado, let's turn this around and take a look at it from above. All right, guys, like I said in the intro, there's a handful of things that are in play into what makes a knife cut. And I've had a lot of people ask me, like, why does one knife cut better than the other? And it all comes down to geometry. So I've got 4 knives here. I've got 2 that have really like thick edge geometry, blade geometry. They don't transition down as thick. They've got a very thick behind the edge thickness, and I have 2 very thin ones. And we're going to look at each independently. We're going to talk about them together. First of all, there's a couple things at play here. Like, some of it is blade width, some of it is blade stock thickness, and things like that. Like, this is a very thick blade stock, but it transitions down to a nice behind the edge thickness. So the fact is, the geometry is what's going to do the majority of the cutting. Your edge is just the icing on the cake. So we're going to look at a couple of really thin ones first, and I'm going to explain what's going on there, and then we'll look at the thicker ones. And I'll explain the pros and cons of both of them. So let's look at the thin ones first. So when I say thin, I'm not talking about like a thin blade stock or a thin knife. I'm talking about thin geometry. This knife comes down very, very thin behind the edge. You can see it just almost disappears. It's almost zero ground. And what that gives you is a really good cutting angle. This knife and this knife both have really good behind the edge thickness. You can see how thin this one is. This is a little bit thicker than that one, but both of these cut really well. And what's going to happen is these will continue to cut even as they start to get dull, because that edge, that behind the edge, everything on it is thin. It's going to slice through material. Now, typically that's accomplished by having a very thin grind on here. You can accomplish it with a hollow or a really good transition like this MAFB. You can see this is very thick blade stock, but you can see with that piercing point, that angle that it's ground to follows all the way down. And you can see how thin and piercing that point is, even on that thick blade stock. This is another example with a little bit broader blade. It comes down nice and thin behind the edge, and it will cut really, really well through a lot of materials. These are your slicier knives. Now, what usually is going to play into that is the width of the blade. So a lot of your narrower blades, we'll see later, are a little bit thicker. You can do it on a narrower blade. Kansept did a really good job on this, getting this thin behind the edge on a relatively narrow knife. But it still gets thick quick. So does this MAFB. Now, I won't say that this does not cut cardboard incredibly well. It does. Knives that have a thinner transition on a broader blade, like where it just transitions nice and thin easily, have a tendency to cut better. Sorry about that. My neighbor had to move his motorcycle when it got loud. The thinner behind the edge geometry is always going to cut better. The broader the blade, the wider the transition, the longer that transition to the edge, the better it's going to slice. And the nice thing about these thin geometries are you can put a more robust edge on them, and it's not going to affect the cutting capability. And we'll talk about that at the very end. But they are always going to be your slicier knives. The thing is, you wind up with some downsides on that, depending on what you're doing with the knife. The edges on these knives with this thinner geometry, there's not as much material to support the edge. The edge won't last as long on some of these thinner knives, unless you do a more robust, like a steeper angle instead of a shallower angle, which you can get away with on a thinner knife because the geometry is what's doing the cutting. So as long as it's thin behind the edge, even if it's a little more blunt, it's still going to cut well. A blunter edge is going to hold up to some of those rigors because there's more material. But generally, these knives that have these thin geometries are going to be the ones that you want for tasks where you're slicing and things like that, where you're not doing a lot of anything that's going to impact the edge or any lateral stresses, like as long as you're not moving that blade. These should hold up okay, but they will get dull a little quicker. This one has a little bit of an advantage because it does not transition as quickly. Like I said, you can see it's kind of a little thicker behind the edge here than this knife is. So this one has a little bit more material behind the general edge overall. But the downside of that, this does slice really well, but it won't slice as well as this one. So typically your broader blades are going to have a narrower behind the edge geometry. Your thinner knives are. And other things as well, like I said, blade stock thickness has a big part to do with it. If you want a narrow blade, but you want it to be thin, you have got to use thinner blade stock. That's going to allow you to transition that thinner because you don't have to remove as much material to get to something that thin. So if you want something that's a narrower blade to be thin behind the edge, you're probably going to want to use thinner blade stock. Your option is make a broader blade, and then you can use your thicker blade stock. So there's your thin geometry, which is what I prefer these days. So let's look at a couple of them that are pretty polar opposite. They're pretty thick behind the edge. Sorry, I meant to mention, I know people's like, you always forget to mention what knives you're showing. This is that TS383 that was a gift. So yeah, great knife. I like this knife a lot. Let's go ahead and we'll look at the ones that are a little bit more thick behind the edge. So the next two knives we're going to look at are the Benchmade 940 and the Ferrum Forge NTAC. Both of these have a relatively thick behind the edge, just an overall thick geometry. And there's a couple of reasons for it. On the Benchmade 940, which we'll talk about first, they didn't utilize as much of the area of the blade where they could have removed material. They could have done this in a fashion where they came further up towards the spine and instead of putting this big swedge in and thin this blade out. But it's a relatively narrow blade. And with the blade stock they used, they got about what they were going to get with this grind. And as you can see by the width of the bevel on this, and then looking at it that way, just in my fingers, you can see behind the edge thickness is really kind of bad on this one. And then I love, even as much as I love this knife, so is this one. This is my Ferrum Forge NTAC, really thick behind the edge. Now, you can mitigate that because, like I said, on a thinner knife, you can use a more steep angle, or on a thicker knife, you can use a thinner angle. And that's kind of how you compensate for it. But this knife will never, ever slice. Neither will this one ever slice as good as the first two we saw. So why is that? Well, because even when you thin this angle out, that transition is so abrupt going from that angle to this angle that the material's not going to be able to be sliced as cleanly or cut as cleanly as it would with the first two. So these knives are really good for robust tasks. Like if you do know that you're going to have to cut into something and then make movements back and forth, that's going to support that thicker material is going to support that edge better. But it's also, like I said, never going to have the cutting horsepower. Now, this blade here could have been much thinner behind the edge. Elliott just didn't do it. Could have been ground a lot thinner with the amount of width on this blade. But Elliott at that time was making very robust, overbuilt knives, which is one of the things that I've always had a problem with the overbuilt knives was they just don't cut all that great. This thing will cut. It'll cut really well. It needs a new edge on it, but I've thinned the edge on this to where it will cut pretty well. But knives with a thicker behind the edge geometry are going to be better for a lot of outdoor tasks where you might do some chopping. You might do this thing like a lot of your fixed blades have got a much thicker behind the edge geometry because they're not being, especially like knives that are like bushcraft and things like that, they're not going to be as thin behind the edge, or they're done in a fashion like a full convex grind where the thing comes up and then you still have a very thin edge, but a robust amount of material behind it. So you can, like I said, try to overcome it by changing your edge angle, which I did on this 940. And like I said, I did on this one, but you're still never going to get that. So the geometry is what does the majority of the cutting. If you don't have a thin geometry, it's never going to slice the way you want. Super Steel Steve did it in an Instagram video where he showed he had a knife that he had not even put an edge on, one of the kitchen knives he makes. And it absolutely was cutting and slicing without even a sharpened edge. Alex Steingraber has done it with knives that he's made where he shows that the geometry is the most important aspect depending on what you're going to do with the knife. So we'll bring these other two back and we'll talk about how they kind of are polar opposites and one of the things that's kind of interesting. Okay. I want to get rid of a couple misconceptions. So a lot of people think I've got a really thin knife. I want a really thin angle at the front. That's not necessarily true. What you want to do is kind of bridge the gap between the slicing ability of this and the edge retention ability of this, because this is going to hold its edge much longer because it's thicker material. So what you can do is, if you have a knife, this one in particular, that is very, very thin, like I said, you can use a steeper angle because the geometry is going to do the cutting. The edge is just going to break through the material first. And that allows you to have a knife that is thinner, that does slice, but has a more robust edge. On these, like I said, you thin the angle out and then you bridge that gap where now I've got a robust amount of material supporting the edge, but it's a little bit thinner and it cuts better. There is no one geometry that's going to fit everything you want to do. Like I said, if you're going to do heavy duty tasks, you're going to want something a little thicker behind the edge that's going to hold up a little bit longer. These are not going to hold an edge as long, but I will tell you that these absolutely are easier to sharpen because you don't have to remove as much material because it is so thin. The other thing too, this knife will stay sharp and have that geometry much longer than this knife. That's another thing you want to consider. This knife thickens up considerably faster than this knife because of the type of grind you have got. Or if it was a hollow grind, it'd be incredibly great if that was a hollow grind. So you are going to have to keep continually adjusting that edge angle to keep it thin and cutting, or what happens is it's going to continually get blunter as that blade gets thicker. You absolutely will run into issues with this if you continue to sharpen it at the same angle throughout the life of the knife. So the geometry is absolutely the most important thing. And like I said, there is no one set depending on what you're going to do with the knife. So having good geometry for the task at hand is absolutely important. Outdoor knives, typically something that might do some chopping, it's going to have a thicker behind the edge thickness and a much steeper edge angle. Knives that you're going to use in the kitchen or around the house will typically have a much thinner grind, thinner blade stock, and a thinner, much more thin edge angle. So that was just, if it doesn't make sense, I apologize. It's just that's just how my brain works around it. But the geometry is absolutely super, super important depending on the task you're going to do. So pick the right tool for the right job. So, all right, guys, let's turn this around and do some final thoughts. There you go, guys. Geometry. It was not just something for school. It's something for you to use in your day-to-day life. And depending on what the task is, I've gotten to where I like the thinner blade stock with the much thinner behind the edge geometry because I find that those do the day-to-day tasks that I like much better. So there you go, guys. That's it on this one. If you like the videos, give them a thumbs up. If you don't like them, give them a thumbs down, but tell me why I can't change the content if you don't tell me what you don't like. If you want to support the channel, there's a couple ways. I have got a merchandise store. I'm not going to talk about that too much, but I have a ton of affiliate links down below where anything you purchase, regardless of whether it's the item you click on for the Amazon links, as a matter of fact, it's a link to my affiliate store. So anything you're going to purchase, from suntan lotion to sunglasses, it doesn't matter if you're buying beach stuff or Barca loungers. I get credit for it. It doesn't cost you anything extra at checkout. Coffee Brand Coffee absolutely has got a 5% discount code associated with it if you use my affiliate link or the coupon code CrazySharp, all one word. And the other way you can do it, I have got a tier-based membership for here on YouTube. Everyone that's a member has access to my Gilded server, which is just like Discord. It's a lot of fun. That's where we goof off and hang out when we're not in videos. The premium and baseline tier members are automatically entered into giveaways that I do on the Gilded server. I'm going to start doing those about once a quarter. And then the premium guys have access to a sharpening tutorial series here on YouTube that's behind a paywall. So that's it on this one, guys. Don't forget, the likes are the most important things you can do for any channel. If you like a channel, give them likes. If you've watched a video for more than like 15 seconds and have not dropped a like, you are not benefiting the channels that you love. You're doing them a disservice. So guys, that's it. Keep it clean in the comment section. It makes me easier for me to moderate the channel. If it's your birthday, happy birthday. And I will see you in the next video.